I'm showing you. I know he was here years ago.
We have a nice.
I know I'm thinking of the other guy.
We're ready to start. We're ready to start. Good evening to you all. Nice summer evening. Glad to see you here. I'm Michael Ehrman. I'm president of the Historical Society. This is a membership voluntary organization. We do have a set of officers and a board of directors, and I'd like to introduce them to you. Helen Wilson in the back is one of our two vice presidents. Our other vice president is missing tonight. We also have our treasurer is on travel as well. Evelyn Young is our treasurer. Betty Connolly is the other vice president. We do have some of our board members in the room. Ralph Lund over there. Audrey Glickman here in the back, manning the barricades, as it were. And Toby Chapman is in the room. There's Toby. Any other board member here that I've missed? I think I've done that all. Helen, do you want to make a quick announcement?
Okay.
Before we get into tonight's program?
While your hands are full. Okay. I'm invisible.
This is very quick, and we never advertise yard sales here, but Mary S. Brown, Ames United Methodist Church, which is the church I research, and Little Turner Cemetery, the very old cemetery right next to it, is having a yard sale on Saturday, June 25th. So if you don't want to go to buy anything, you can come and take a look at the church, which its future's in jeopardy, so this might be a chance to see it and to walk in the graveyard, which dates to 1785. It's the second oldest graveyard in Pittsburgh. So anyway, there's a few flyers left, and stop by if you'd like to see the site.
Thank you, Helen. We are a membership group. We welcome memberships. We have a lot of old members here tonight, but we have a bunch of new people. And it's $15 for an individual and $25 for a couple. We have forms in the back. We've set a record membership this year, which I thank those who've signed up, but we want to keep building. Our major activity, but not the only one, is that we have these meetings. And I want to ask you to be strong. We have 2 of them in July. We had a snow out in January, so we're asking you to come the 12th and the 26th for 2 very interesting programs. The first is the auto dealers and service stations of Squirrel Hill, with Maury Sable talking to us from his own experience of his family owning some of them. And then Linda Neiman from the Penn Brewery, one of the executives there, is going to talk about 150 years of beer and the history of the Penn Brewery. We do a mix of local and more region-wide talks, so that will be at the end of July. In September, and the rest of these you have on a list here, we have Barbara Burstein. Many of you know her. Going to talk about the Jews of Squirrel Hill. She's talked before, but she's done a lot of new information, and we're looking forward to that. One other thing, you have a flyer. We are going to participate in the 200th anniversary of Pittsburgh's incorporation with a parade and a festivity on July 9th, starting for us at 11th and Liberty, going down to Point State Park. They're going to be representatives of all of the families of all the mayors in Pittsburgh that they can find. We're going to have a banner. A few of us at least will go, and we'd like others too. There's no charge, of course, for this. I've handed out a sign-up sheet. You can tell me, you can mail, you can call, you can do it to the last minute. Anyone who signs up, I'll call them the day before or 2 days before to confirm that everything's in shape. That's July 9th.
Wear your Squirrel Hill clothes.
wear your Squirrel Hill clothes.
Whatever.
We don't have the money to provide you each with a t-shirt, but we did get a banner. Our speaker tonight is Steve, how do you pronounce your last name? Mihaly. Steve is a longtime executive at H.J. Heinz Company, lived in the city, or lived in the area for 20 plus years, but has an interesting hobby. He collects political memorabilia. Good year to talk about political memorabilia, right? I think this campaign has started quicker than any presidential campaign I've ever seen. You know, a month before the conventions, all the issues are getting put out on the table right away. Anyway, Steve called us and wanted to come and talk about his favorite hobby, and we welcome you. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. I'm not really used to speaking with the microphone. I don't walk around my house with a microphone. My name is Steve Mihaly. I've been a political collector, a political historian for a little over 50 years. I see the shock looks on a couple of people's faces. You know, either you're thinking, one, it doesn't quite look that old. You know, or two, you're thinking, that's just plain nuts. Either way, if it's the first one, I appreciate the kind sentiment, and if it's the second one, well, I kind of agree. You know, it is a little bit nuts. Tonight we're going to talk about marketing the presidency. This isn't going to be a heavy political discussion. We've had enough of that in the last few months. This is going to be more on the lighter side. Looking back across the last, let's say, 200 years, in the interesting ways candidates have marketed themselves. Now, marketing sounds like a modern day term, but in reality, candidates have been marketing themselves or their ideas, or marketing against the other candidate, literally since the start of politics, since the start of presidential elections. And to illustrate that, this is James Monroe was our 5th president, and he produced little wooden snuff boxes. You can actually see that in one of the cases over here. Okay, so this snuff box is well over 150 years old. And basically what it's saying is, pictures him, and what it's really saying is, support my program, support my doctrine. But the real marketing of the presidency, from my perspective, started with the election of 1896. And the reason I say that is the campaign, that is the year that political buttons were invented. Buttons such as this. I'm wearing a button that says campaign button. I have a gentleman right in front of me that has a Bernie button on. But this is the year that campaign buttons were invented. And they were mass produced. They were distributed in packages of gum or packages of loose tobacco and then mailed across the country. Prior to that, and also with this campaign, you had silk ribbons. So here's a nice example. William McKinley was the Republican candidate that particular year. His running mate was Garrett Hobart of New Jersey, so you had silk ribbons. And you had china pieces. Here's a plate of his opponent, his Democratic opponent, William Jennings Bryan, with his running mate. Now, does anyone know what the big, I'm going to flip that. Does anyone know what the big campaign issue was in this election? And no, my daughter can't answer. This issue was as big as Iran and Afghanistan, healthcare, or it was called bimetallism. Okay? And it's hard to imagine that people got into huge arguments, actual fights, over what would be the currency of the United States. But that was the huge campaign issue. And so if you were a Republican, you were for gold or a gold standard. And here's a variety of campaign pieces from that time frame. And it says things like gold basis, I will vote for sound money. And notice at the base here, there's a couple of little things, and those are bugs. And if you were a Republican for gold, you were considered a gold bug. Here's an example of a gold bug, and those wings on the bug fold in, and there's a little lever on the back. Again, this item is in the case over to my right, and the wings pop up and show the images of the candidates. If you were a Democrat, you were for silver, and you were considered a silver bug. Okay? But notice on these campaign pieces, you also have some interesting nomenclature on it. And it says 16 to 1. And what that meant at that time, 16 ounces of silver equaled 1 ounce of gold. That ratio has changed dramatically in recent times, but back then it was 16 to 1. And they also produced clocks or clock faces with the clock permanently stuck at 16 minutes to 1. See that? Those two items right there? There's the clock, and it's 16 minutes to 1. This is what is considered a McKinley soap baby. I've always found this piece unusual. Again, it's in the case over here. It's in a box. The box is roughly about 3.5 inches long, and it's made entirely of soap. It was marketed for children. But of course, children couldn't vote in this election. And then you think, who was the primary caretaker at that time? And it was most likely it was women. And by the way, women could not vote at this time. They're not able to vote until another 24 years, until 1920. But still, it's a McKinley soap baby, and it says, I am for McKinley and sound money, ain't you? No 16 to 1 for me. McKinley came to Pittsburgh to promote his campaign and sound money. Obviously, he came right before the election on October 31st in 1896. Anybody notice anything unusual about this ribbon?
No
H.
No H. The H did not come into existence for another year. Now, here's a nice marketing piece. This is a silk handkerchief. And so if you wanted to wipe away your tears or blow your nose, you could blow it right on McKinley and his running mate, Garrett Hobart. Now, this is not going to turn into a historical quiz, so this will probably be the last question I ask. Does anyone here know why Garrett Hobart is so important to political history? He's very important to political history.
He's got a street named after him here.
That's possible. That wasn't the answer I was looking for. But he's so important because he dies. He dies of natural causes in office. Okay? Now, the vice presidency historically has never been worth much. Let's face it. Okay? Back then, it was worth much less than it is today. Matter of fact, John Garner, who was one of FDR's vice presidents, famously said that the vice presidency was not worth a warm cup of spit. And that was really true back around the turn of the century. So it was a place filler position. The Republican bosses needed to fill that because McKinley's going to run again for a second term in 1900. So they just need to put somebody in the job. There's this Republican governor of New York. And by the way, I want you to notice how many times I say the states Ohio and New York during the course of this presentation. Because those two states have literally dominated the political landscape of this country clearly for the last 125 years. Matter of fact, if you think about this current election, Donald Trump, where is he from? Businessman from New York. Hillary Clinton, where is she from? Ex-senator from New York, okay? Even their close rivals, Bernie Sanders, of course, was senator from Vermont, but he often touted his New York roots. And of course, John Kasich, where was he from? Governor of Ohio. And yes, the rest of the country would say Ohio. Anyway, that's That's why Roosevelt is so important in this. So the Republican bosses come to Roosevelt and say, we want you to run as McKinley's vice president. You know, not as a great honor, they want to get rid of him. Okay, they want him in that job so he will go away. Okay, it's as simple as that.
They wanted to get into it.
Yes. Even in his own autobiography, Roosevelt felt it was the end of his political career. He accepted the position due to sense of party and country and duty. So the ticket of McKinley and Roosevelt is formed in the campaign of 1900. Notice the gold colors again. We're still talking about the gold standard and all of that sort of thing. McKinley is so certain of victory in this campaign that he doesn't campaign. He goes to his home in Canton, Ohio. He has a big Victorian home with a big wraparound porch. And day after day, from the late spring through the early fall, he would come out every day. These huge delegations of people would come out to see him. And he would wave, he might give a short speech, take a couple of pictures, and then frankly he'd go back in and take a nap. Okay. Roosevelt decided to campaign, and he was all over the country. The political bosses were okay with that because they wanted him nowhere close to Washington. Okay, so Roosevelt's running around the country, and McKinley, who's the president, sitting president, is sleeping in Ohio. What does that say? Nobody's running the country. It shows how different it is today.
Well, I don't know.
In terms of a marketing piece, you have really nice etched china glasses or glassware showing McKinley and Roosevelt. Back up. Now, what happens though is McKinley wins the election. He wins it against William Jennings Bryan. And there's an event that the bosses never foresee. He goes to an exposition, a fair, up in Buffalo, New York, very early in his second term. And he is shot by an extremist up there. Now, where's Teddy Roosevelt? That actually could be the title for the next 20 years of this country. Where's Teddy? Okay? And by the way, where is Teddy when McKinley is shot? He's with a group of people hiking in the Adirondacks. Okay? Again, nobody's in Washington. Teddy finds out that the president has been shot, his boss. He wires to both Buffalo and Washington, D.C. and says, should I come there? Should I come to Buffalo? Should I come to Washington, D.C.? They wire back and go, nah. You know, keep on hiking, no problems. Seriously. And they say, no problems, don't worry about it. So he does. He continues on his trek, okay? In the meantime, though, McKinley's been shot. He gets better, he gets worse, he gets better, he gets worse, he dies. Uh-oh. That was the one event that the bosses had never foreseen. The guy that they thought they were getting rid of as vice president has now become president of the United States.
You know, the comment was that damn cowboy is in the White House.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that a little bit. Teddy Roosevelt fulfills the remainder, it's about 3.5 years of the McKinley term, and he runs on his own in 1904 for the presidency. Roosevelt is known at this time as Colonel Teddy Roosevelt. He was a war hero. He had been in the Spanish-American War, led his Rough Riders up San Juan Hill. He was known for his Rough Rider cap. He wore these kind of funky spectacles that you see here, and that's an example of them with his running mate on the right-hand side, Charles Fairbanks. He loved a certain phrase. It was an old tribal African phrase called walk softly and carry a big stick. And that's a big stick pin, and if you look very closely on it, on the far right-hand side, it has the initials of TR. In this country, Teddy Roosevelt was known simply as TR. But he was probably the first American politician, certainly in the 20th century, that had an international following, and he was known as the American. He ran against a person by the name of Alton Parker, who was governor of New York. Notice I've said New York or Ohio now about 4 times. Teddy Roosevelt handily defeats, though, Alton Parker, and the merchandising begins. Here we have, and from my perspective, Teddy Roosevelt is the first real rock star president. Here we have a nice bandana with his initials and kind of that cowboy image that you were talking about earlier. Here he is standing very regally at Yosemite. That is Yosemite Falls in the background and Half Dome also in the background. This is a stereo card. You could dine on Teddy Roosevelt plates. You could drink from Teddy Roosevelt mugs. You could stir the drink with your Teddy Roosevelt spoon. You could put the plate, the mug, and the spoon on your Teddy Roosevelt tray. And once you were done, and you left the dining room or parlor, you could close the door and secure it with your Teddy Roosevelt doorstop. At the end of that term, the election now is 1908. Teddy comes along and basically says, you know, I've been president for close to 8 years. That's good enough. You know, I think I want to go hunt. And he literally hand selects his successor, a good friend of his, William Howard Taft of Ohio. Although he's never held public office, he's held a lot of administrative positions, but not elected public office. Notice that button at the top. It says United. But if you look carefully between the U, the N, and the I, there are dashes, and it says U-N-I Ted. Okay? The two of them shaking hands. Taft actually doesn't really want to be president. Okay? He has to be convinced to run. And he's pretty well assured of winning. He really wants to be on the Supreme Court. But Teddy Roosevelt pops him in and says, you know, being president's a great job. You'll like it. You know? So he says, okay. And Teddy picked Taft because he saw him as the safest. See that bottom button? It says the safest. And it also has in red his initials. That Taft will continue the progressive policies of Roosevelt. Now, as a side note, Taft was a huge man, particularly for that time frame. It's believed he tipped the scales around 350 pounds. There's a great story, I don't know if it's true, but I like to believe that it's true, that he once got stuck and had to be pried out of the White House bathtub. What is absolutely true, though, is during that time frame, most men were shorter than they are today, and they were slighter or slimmer. So when Taft went to dinner or had lunch or spoke at a public event, they had to specially construct chairs to allow for his girth. And they would also reinforce the speaking platforms so it wouldn't collapse. Here's a nice example of a marketing piece. It's a nice silk ribbon showing Taft and his running mate, Bill Sherman. James Sherman. You have plates during this time. Here it shows Smiling Bill and Sunny Jim, the invincible duo. You could have a Taft and Sherman paperweight. Or a tip tray. Taft was for playgrounds. Think about that for a second. How can you be against playgrounds? It's tough to campaign and say, I'm not for playgrounds. Where was Teddy? Teddy, by the way, is still the most popular figure, even though he's not president in the United States. Well, Teddy went off to Africa to hunt for big game. And while he's over there, there's these marketing pieces that are produced. These are clothing buttons. And the top one shows Teddy Roosevelt shooting a lion. The one on the right shows Teddy hunting down a rhino, and the bottom one here shows him riding an elephant. Now, he comes back from Europe, and he goes on another hunting trip down in Kentucky. And he usually, like I said, he's the first rock star president. And he often travels with an entourage of reporters and other people with him. And while hunting down in the southeast, he corners a small bear, okay? And he magnanimously puts down his gun and says, "I cannot shoot this bear, it is but a cub." The crowd goes wild. There are no photographers at this event, but there are sketch artists, okay? And these sketch artists madly start sketching this particular scene and send them up to New York City. And a couple of these sketches end up in the hands of a toy company. The toy company is the Steve Toy Company, still in existence to this day, okay? And they start producing little toy bears, okay, with hunting caps and hunting jackets and little funky glasses and mustaches. And yes, they call them teddy bears. And so if you're ever on Jeopardy and have that question for $200, Alex, I expect all of you to be able to answer, who is the president that inspired the teddy bear? And to this day, not only do we still call them teddy bears, but some high-end teddy bears, if you look closely, still have those hunting hats and jackets and mustaches and glasses. Not only did they produce teddy bears, but souvenir shops started producing porcelain pieces, and these are toothpick holders. And it shows Teddy and the bear. Okay, and it shows Teddy and there's the bear, and right here is where you put the toothpicks. But notice it also says Newcastle, Pennsylvania. Okay, this one down here is from Frostburg, Maryland.
He wasn't president anymore.
No, but like I said, he's a rock star. People are way more interested in his doings than what's going on with Taft in the country. If you didn't have a teddy bear or a toothpick holder, you could have a button that says, "Won't you be my teddy bear?" Or there were actual clothing buttons of teddy bears that you could use and wear on your coat. Now, in the meantime, he goes back to Europe on a big game hunting trip, so second time to Europe. Okay, the time frame is roughly about 1910. He has a huge throng of reporters, primarily again from New York, with him. And they're telling him about what's going on in the country. And in particular, he's getting a little bit worried because Taft isn't following his progressive policies. You know, he's out there promoting playgrounds. Remember, Roosevelt is the guy that essentially initiated the national park system. National parks, playgrounds, not kind of on the same level. This is Teddy Roosevelt's the president that busted up the trusts, the steel trust, the oil trust, busted up the banks, was for huge environmental issues, was the first president to have a black man to dinner at the White House. Booker T. Washington had won the Nobel Peace Prize. So he's kind of getting worried that Taft, who he handpicked, isn't really following in his footsteps. So he decides to come back to the United States. He comes back on a steam freighter, and this button, and there are literally thousands of people there to greet him. Teddy is going to save us. Okay? And there, in this button, Uncle Sam is there to greet him, but if you look really closely on the button, there's a rhinoceros, there's a giraffe, there's what appears to be a zebra, a lion is coming down the gangplank, you got the TR bag sitting here, etc. There's a news conference, a press conference, and one of the reporters supposedly yells out to him, "Teddy, how do you feel?" And his response supposedly was, "I feel as fit as a bull moose." I'm not sure how a bull moose feels, but apparently it was pretty good.
an
And another reporter yells, Teddy, are you going to run for president? This is the upcoming election of 1912. Takes his hat, throws it up in the air, and says, my hat is in the ring. Okay? Now both of those stories are also in dispute. But what is not in dispute is there were campaign pieces that show the wording, my hat is in the ring, Teddy or TR. This piece shows his hat inside the ring. And he goes on to form the Independent Progressive Party, which becomes familiarly known as the Bull Moose Party.
There's a lot of trouble with the apostrophes back then.
Now Taft, this is the election of 1912. Taft is the sitting president. He goes, wait a minute, I'm still here. And he decides he wants to run. This is the guy that really didn't want to be president. But he's decided, what, this is a pretty good gig. I like being president. So he gets the Republican nomination. So this is a very famous election, the election of 1912. It is the only time you have a sitting president, William Howard Taft, running against a past president, Theodore Roosevelt, running against what will become the future president, Woodrow Wilson. What happens, of course, is Taft and Roosevelt split the Republican and independent votes. Teddy Roosevelt actually way outpolls Taft in both popular vote and electoral vote. But it wasn't enough, and Wilson squeaks in. Taft actually ran on what was called a no third term platform, an anti-Teddy Roosevelt platform. Teddy basically had had 2 previous terms, and he was running for a third. Wilson, who was the eventual winner, ran on a policy of labor initiatives, with the big one being capping the work week at an 8-hour day. Wilson, in 1916, decides to run again. And this time, he actually runs on a peace platform. Not a lot of people know this. And as you can see in the buttons, it says peace, preparedness, Wilson. Wilson, peace and prosperity. War in Europe, peace in America. God bless Wilson. World War I has started up. He runs against a person by the name of Charles Evans Hughes, who, by the way, is the governor of New York. Wilson handily defeats Hughes. What happens? He enters us into World War I. You're going to see the same thing almost 50 years later. We'll talk about it in the 1960s. So we're now in World War I. Wilson's marketing team says, well, we're in the war, so we better start producing pieces that show Wilson and General John Pershing, and we better back our president. Now, the big social issue at this point in time is the amendment to allow women to vote. And it had to be voted on state by state. So you see a variety of pieces here from different states and different time frames. In the bottom right-hand corner is a piece from Pennsylvania, and apparently that initiative took place in 1915. Women do get the vote. The first election that they can vote is 1920. Wilson decides not to run for a third term. In reality, what the country doesn't know is he's very ill. He's very ill, mainly the last 2 years of his presidency, and it's believed that his wife is pretty much running the country. So both the Republicans and the Democrats need to pick new candidates. And in the case of the Republicans, they choose Warren Harding, who is the past governor of Ohio. His running mate is Calvin Coolidge, who's the governor of Massachusetts. Harding was the very definition of a backroom politician. He loved cigars. He loved late-night poker games. He was a womanizer. He loved a good, strong drink. Sounds like a great person to hang out with. This is a large Warren G. Harding cigar. You can physically see it in the case over on the wall. I don't think it would taste very good these days. It's close to 100 years old, and it is a giant cigar. This is sort of the era of flappers, and so this is a Harding and Coolidge beanie. They run the Democratic opponent is a guy by the name of James Cox. James Cox is the sitting governor of Ohio. Gee, there's that Ohio-New York thing going on again. He is a publisher, a media magnate, and the Cox Publishing Media Company to this day is still very much in existence. What's interesting about this campaign, though, is notice the name of the running mate. Here's another Jeopardy trivia question for you. It's Cox and Roosevelt, and yes, that Roosevelt is Franklin D. Roosevelt. He is Cox, James Cox's running mate in 1920. So he actually ran for vice president well before he became president by 12 years. And by the way, he did not have infantile paralysis or polio. He was not in a wheelchair at this point in time. And by the way, Roosevelt was the US Senator from New York. Harding and Coolidge, though, go on to defeat easily Cox and Roosevelt. On a tour of the West Coast during a late-night poker game in 1923, Harding apparently had a few too many drinks and a few too many smokes and died of a massive heart attack. Coolidge becomes president, okay, and decides in 1924 to run on his own. There's a great story. He's called Silent Cal. You've probably heard that. And there's a great story about him. He was at a White House dinner, and a Washington, D.C. socialite was sitting next to him. And she said to the president, "I have a bet with my friend that I can get you to say more than 3 words." He looks at her and says, "You lose," and turns away and does not speak to her for the rest of the evening. Coolidge runs in 1924 against a Democrat by the name of John Davis. John Davis is from West Virginia. West Virginia at this time is known for its fruit trees and berries and so on and so forth. So one of the things that he produces as a marketing gimmick was little berry glasses with his name imprinted in the base of the glass. Coolidge, of course, goes on to win the presidency, but decides not to run for a second term. It's believed old Silent Cal is a pretty smart guy. And it has been discovered in recent history that he had some sense that the economy, starting in 1920s, was not as robust as everybody thought. So he says, "No, I'm not going to run again. I'm going to go back to my farm in Vermont, milk the cows, and hang out." So both the Republicans and the Democrats now need to choose new candidates. The Republicans choose a guy by the name of Herbert Hoover, another person that has had no political experience, no elected political experience. He has had various administrative jobs. He runs against a person by the name of Al Smith. Al is the past mayor of New York City, and yes, the governor of New York. Hoover's campaign slogan was a kind of a takeoff on his name, and he produced these little owls as marketing pieces that said, Hoover. The big issue, though, in this campaign was that Al Smith was the first practicing Catholic to run for president. So if you want to express your views in a mild way, you would wear the button on the bottom left that said, "Another Democrat for Hoover." If you wanted to be a little bit stronger, you could come along and say, "I'm anti-Smith." Okay? If you want to be really say what's on your mind, you could say, "I want a Christian in the White House." Al Smith was known for his brown derby. So one of his campaign features was lots of pins and other paraphernalia featuring the brown derby. And you can see that in several items here. Hoover produced these giant water urns. I find this absolutely frightening. You know, and it's got a facsimile signature on the side, and then a giant bust of Hoover, so you could have the water poured out of Hoover's head. Hoover, of course, wins the election, but what happens very early in his campaign is the Depression. Who do we blame for the Depression, even to this day? Herbert Hoover. But the reality of it is the seeds were sown way before that, probably a good 3 to 5 years. And Cal is sitting up happily with the cows in Vermont. Hoover decides to run for re-election. Not sure if that was a smart move, but and so he produced various things that said, don't swap horses in the middle of the stream, keep Hoover, it's an elephant job, no time for donkey business. One of the marketing pieces he produced was needle books for primarily women. You open this up and there's needle packets inside. You could have a Herbert Hoover pencil and his head is the eraser. The Democrats had none of this. FDR is actually the person now running for president. Their slogan was, kick out the Depression with a Democratic vote. You pull the string on the donkey on the left-hand side and it kicks the elephant's rear. We now have the first appearance of Alfred E. Newman. He's a lot earlier than most people think. Probably some of you thought he was late 50s or 60s. No, he was the 1932.
Right.
Sure, I'm for Hoover. I'm for Roosevelt. Big social issue at this time was that it was dry. There was no beer, no alcohol sales, at least no legal beer or alcohol sales, and similar to women's suffrage, that amendment had to be passed state by state, date by date. By the way, the first Roosevelt promise, and he delivered, his very first legislative act was the repeal of Prohibition on day one that he got elected. Roosevelt also produced needle books. This is early in 1932. I love this piece because it shows his optimism in the country. Notice what it says up here. In full harmony, in full swing, happy again, back to work. Recognize the Depression is in full bloom at this point in time. Matter of fact, the Depression really doesn't come out till essentially the middle piece of World War II. You could have an FDR stovepipe cover. And this would fit on your stovepipe, and FDR would be staring back at you. FDR decides to run for a second term, and this is the campaign of 1936, and he runs against a person by the name of Alf Landon. Alf Landon actually is from Pennsylvania. Little piece of, again, Jeopardy trivia here. He was born and bred in West Middlesex, Pennsylvania. It's a small town just to the west of Sharon, PA, if you go up 79. However, Landon was the governor of Kansas. Kansas is the sunflower state. So his marketing geniuses decided that it would be a great idea to make all of his campaign pieces look like sunflowers. Well, apparently they should have all been fired. Here's an example. This is a license plate attachment for Landon. This is the early equivalent of a bumper sticker. It's made of metal. It's also in the case to my right. And you would attach it via the little bolt on your bumper of the back of your automobile. His slogan was "Off the rocks with Landon and Knox," but apparently the public didn't buy it. Landon only carried 2 states, 2 very small states, Maine and New Hampshire. FDR took all of the rest of the United States. The election of 1940, one of the most vicious campaigns, and has a lot of similarities to the current campaign. This is FDR's 3rd term, unprecedented. Now, there's no rule or law at this point in time that prohibits a president from running for a third term. The Republican candidate is a guy by the name of Wendell Willkie. Willkie is a registered Democrat 2 years before this election. He is not a politician, he is a businessman. You can see where I'm going with this. He was the president of a utility company in Indiana, but he didn't like how the government was being run and FDR's policies. So he said, I'm going to run for president, and I'm going to finance my own campaign. Oh, heard that recently? His campaign slogan was, life begins in 40. Because of his name, he had lots of cool campaign pieces that involved keys. The key to prosperity, the key to your future, the key to happiness. Lots of negative campaign pieces in this. Let's just read a few here. Of course, it was the third term, so no third term. After 8 years, still 9 million out of work, enough said. There's no fool like an old fool but Roosevelt. Dr. Jekyll of Hyde Park. Hyde Park, of course, was Roosevelt's home. The New Deal wastebasket. Misdeal a New Deal. Outstealing third. No more fireside chats. Roosevelt would have radio fireside chats. I want to be a captain too. His son Elliot got drafted into the Army on day one. He was not a private. They made him a captain. And of course, the country didn't want, or the Willkie forces didn't want Eleanor either. And this campaign is symbolic of this. This is the first time that a first lady actually played a major role in the campaign. Of course, Eleanor Roosevelt. Roosevelt came out with his own negative campaigning. Keep Roosevelt in the White House, Willkie in the powerhouse. A third term is better than a third rater. If Willkie's in White House, that's U.S. in poorhouse. Confucius say 1 time good, 2 times good, 3 times damn good. You start to see companies getting involved. Here's a dice cup from Rome, New York. Don't gamble like Willkie. Willkie supposedly produced 100 million buttons. That was one for virtually every voter at that time in the United States. There was a Life magazine cover that said, can 100 million buttons be wrong? This is the first campaign where you have celebrity endorsements. You know, and that's Joe Louis, who was the sitting world champion, boxing world champion, and says, Joe and I want what? Willkie. Of course, FDR won his third term, and then in between he starts marketing and producing his own items. This is a Toby jug. I think this looks a little bit better than the Hoover one, you know, so it shows FDR, and you can pour your favorite beverage into that. FDR goes on to run for a 4th term. This is 1944. The piece at the top is interesting because it shows the Allies, FDR, Churchill, and we tend to forget who the third one was. Stalin. We are going to win this war and win the peace that follows. What the country doesn't really know is how ill FDR is. Matter of fact, he really does not campaign in this election. He's rarely seen at this time. But the country is kind of scared about changing courses. We are in the middle of World War II. And of course, FDR wins a 4th term. He runs against a person by the name of Thomas Dewey and John Bricker. Tom Dewey is, yes, you guessed it, the governor of New York, and John Bricker, by the way, is the governor of Ohio. A little piece of trivia now for you. Tom Dewey is the last major political candidate to run from either party and get the nomination with facial hair. So since that point in time, in 1944, there have been no major party candidates that have gotten the nomination with a beard or mustache. Tom Dewey was known as kind of a crime-busting, you know, and he kind of looks it, doesn't he? He has that real stern look about him. This is one of his marketing pieces was a woman's compact. How did you you ladies have to, look at this. You open this up and there's a clutch on the side and there's a mirror and a powder puff inside. But I think the image on top is somewhat frightening. Of course, FDR, like I said, won that election against Dewey and Bricker. But very early on in his fourth term, of course, he dies down in Warm Springs, Arkansas. His running mate was Harry Truman, okay, senator from Missouri. Truman fills out FDR's term, and in 1948 decides to run on his own. And his platform, interestingly enough, was on a couple of things you think about in more later times. Civil rights. You think of civil rights primarily in the 60s, 70s, maybe even up to today, and human rights. Most people don't associate civil rights and human rights with the 1940s. I would think most people associate that terminology maybe, as recently as 2000 or 2004, 2008. Truman had a saying, the buck stops here, and he passed out his marketing devices, small wooden bucks. He runs again against Tom Dewey, who, by the way, is still the governor of New York. His running mate this time is a guy by the name of Earl Warren, who later goes on to fame in the Supreme Court and is known for the Warren Report on the JFK assassination.
From where?
Earl Warren's from California. Dewey and Warren campaigned coast to coast, and they produced pennants to prove it. They have little clickers that say, click with Dewey and Warren. They form what are called 4-H clubs. Help hustle Harry home. However, the public, quite frankly, is just wild about Harry. And he would give these speeches about the do-nothing Congress, and he would say the do-nothing Congress won't do, and the crowd would respond back, give him hell, Harry! This is also the campaign that modern-day polling took place, but not until after the campaign. It was believed that Tom Dewey won that election. Even on election night, Dewey went to bed thinking he was president. In the morning, he wakes up and finds out that Harry Truman wins the election because the public was wild about him, even if the pundits were not. There's a great picture of Harry Truman the next morning holding up a Chicago paper with the headline, Dewey wins. In 1952, Harry decides not to run for re-election, so once again, both parties need to choose new candidates. The Republicans choose General Eisenhower. He, of course, was famous for his wartime heroics during World War II. Prior to running for president, Eisenhower had actually never voted for president. Matter of fact, he wasn't even registered. Okay? When both parties approached him to run on both the Republican and Democrat, and he had to think about it for a while. He wasn't sure if he was a Republican or a Democrat. He finally decided he was a Republican. The Republicans were thrilled because he was truly the most popular guy in the country. His campaign slogan for both campaigns was a slogan called I Like Ike, a little piece of trivia now. That slogan was developed by a Pittsburgh advertising agency by the name of A.G. Trimble, who is still in business to this day. They used various phraseology on that I Like Ike slogan, so it was I like Ike, we like Ike, they like Ike, I like Ike and Dick, and every other nomenclature you can think. He ran in 1952 against a guy by the name of Adlai Stevenson. If you weren't sure who you were for, you could have a salesman play it safe set of conflicts. On your left arm, you could wear a picture of Eisenhower, and on your right arm, you could have Stevenson. So if you were at the bar or at a restaurant and somebody said, asked you who you were for, if you could figure out their political leanings, you could show them your left hand or your right hand. Early early on in this campaign, Stevenson was at a rally, and he was sitting up on a stage with his legs crossed, and there was a photographer shooting upwards. He was down below. And he was shooting upwards, and the photograph caught the bottom of Stevenson's shoe. And Stevenson had been doing so much campaigning that there was a big hole worn in his shoe. At first the Democrats were mortified. And it's like, this doesn't look good. But they decided in true marketing fashion, let's turn a negative into a positive. Okay? And so they started producing little silver tie tacks with holes in them. Okay? Showing that Stevenson is a man for the people, and he's pounding the streets and working hard for you. The Republicans would have none of it. They came along with the same image and said, don't let this happen to you, vote for Eisenhower. Also in this campaign, a big issue was who Eisenhower chose as his running mate. And of course, that was Richard Nixon. This is the time of the famed Checkers speech. Also, the Korean War is going on, so you've got a piece in the middle there that says, I like Stevenson. Eisenhower produced a plethora of marketing pieces. You could have Eisenhower sunglasses, an Eisenhower ruler, we like Ike, every inch of the way. The next piece is a bar of soap with Eisenhower's picture on it that says clean up with Ike, and the bottom item is sugar cubes. And you could drop those into your drink of coffee and tea and spell out Ike.
Who's the woman with Ike on the board?
That's Mamie Eisenhower's wife.
Oh,
If you were a woman, you could have Eisenhower's hosiery. This is a great politically incorrect piece now. You know, this is a unit for Eisenhower ashtray, and of course it comes from this area, Allegheny College, right up the road, north on Interstate 79. If you were lucky enough, you could snag one of these. You could board Air Force One with a Dwight Eisenhower glass. Eisenhower, of course, wins the election. He runs again. Democrats decide to run Stevenson again. This is the campaign of 1956. His running mate this time is a guy by the name of Estes Kefauver. He's the only person I have ever known with the first name of Estes. However, before he chooses Kefauver, a little known political fact is that Stevenson actually approaches several prominent Democrats who will come into their own later on. He approaches Humphrey to be his vice president. Hubert's a pretty smart guy. He has political ambitions, and he says, no, thank you. He also approaches John F. Kennedy. Notice all of the pieces say John F. Kennedy for vice president. But again, Kennedy is the junior senator from Massachusetts. He's a smart guy. He quite frankly knows Stevenson's going to lose. He's got strong political ambitions and decides he wants to sit this one out. This is the first campaign that is on TV. Of course, Eisenhower wins, defeats Stevenson for the second time, and now Eisenhower retires to his farm in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and so both parties need to, again, choose new candidates.
but the Eisenhower campaign was the first to have a campaign jingle, right?
Yes. Also, it's partially inspired because of TV. And so in this particular campaign in 1960, of course, it was the campaign of John Kennedy versus Richard Nixon. Kennedy was very youthful. He was a war hero. He had captained a PT boat in the South Pacific called PT 109. This is various PT boat pens, but what's interesting about this is the price you had to pay at that time for these PT boat pens. If you wanted a bronze one, which is the bottom one, that would cost you $25, the silver one $50, and the gold one $100.
What a bargain.
If you were lucky enough to be a delegate to the 1960 convention, you could have a paperweight with one of those PT boat pens essentially sealed inside the paperweight. Of course, there was Jackie Kennedy, huge campaign asset, young and beautiful. Nixon tried to make himself in the image of Lincoln and Eisenhower. Nixon came out with a campaign piece on voting for Nixon. No giveaways, no apologies, no pie in the sky. Remember, it's your money. Jack will play poker with. Also, you have the Cold War going on here. Look at the phraseology on the bottom piece. Khrushchev does not want Nixon in Lodge. I do. There's some sense that Kennedy is trying to buy the campaign. Nixon comes out with pieces that show the White House and a not for sale sign on the lawn. Excuse me. And buttons that say, don't be a jackass, vote Republican. And to some degree, Nixon is correct in Kennedy's buying the campaign. Here's a piece called the 750 Club. To get this little piece, you had to donate $750. Now you might be sitting there and go, that doesn't sound terribly outrageous, but you got to remember, this is 1960. At that time, the average wage was probably between $4,500 and $5,000 a year. You could definitely buy a brand new car for roughly $2,000. So $750 is quite a bit of money in 1960. Nixon also came out with little clickers that said, click with Dick. Gloves, gardening gloves. I'm working for Nixon and Lodge. This is a Nixon baby rattle. Have no idea why they would produce this. You would hang this over your child's crib. It's also in the case. Let me tell you, this is heavy. This probably weighs about a pound and a half. And if it actually fell on the kid, you could have a game. Put Nixon in the right slots. You could open your mail with a Nixon letter opener. You stole my thunder. I was going to pull it out of my pocket. 2 years ago, I gave a similar presentation at Fox Chapel High School. And this was very, very high honor history students. These kids were really smart. I came to this slide, okay, held it up and said, does anyone know what this is? It was roughly about 20 to 25 in the row. Not a single person. Matter of fact, they thought I was nuts when I told them, yeah, you actually put it in the rotary dial. They're looking at me like I have 3 heads. Yes, it's not a presidential piece, but I still like it. It's a telephone dialer. You have corporate sponsorship. Nixon drinks Canada Dry. Who knew? Nixon, of course, lost the election. Here's a button that says, I bet on Nixon, but I can still wish you a Merry Christmas. Kennedy, of course, gets elected, and very early in his term, they start producing packs of Kennedy cards. You could buy these at local stores that sold newspapers and cigarettes and candy and that sort of thing. The ace is, of course, Jack. The king of clubs is Teddy, king of diamonds, Bobby. There's Jackie, and of course, Papa Joe. You could have Jack and Jackie Halloween mask. Here's a great item. The exciting new game of bluff. You've got Kennedy on the right. I have this piece right over there. You can probably see it in between the two keys. That's Kennedy on the right and Khrushchev on the left. You got to remember at this time, and some of you may have lived through this time frame, the country's freaked out. You've got potentially nuclear missiles sitting roughly 90 miles off the coast of Florida, and we're marketing this. So the country is going, I miss Ike. Hell, I even miss Harry. Come back, Truman, all is forgiven. Stevenson decides he might want to jump back into the race. And of course, we know what happened in Dallas. This is a statue that was produced as a marketing piece of John Jr., the famous salute as the casket is going by. Sometimes people ask me, would Kennedy have run for a second term in 1964? Of course, we don't know that for sure, but what we do know is they were already starting to make campaign pieces for Kennedy in 1964. The top is a Kennedy key, and it says K64. The second piece is Kennedy and Kerner. Otto Kerner was the governor of Illinois, so it's sort of a coattail piece. And the bottom piece there is Kennedy's rocking chair, and it says 64. Here's a child's bike's license plate, and it says JFK 464, and of course it was from California. His vice president, of course, Lyndon Johnson, decides to take up the reins. And his slogan, or his phraseology, is the Great Society. He's running with Hubert Humphrey, who we saw earlier, who is Stevenson. And you've got the haunting specter of John Kennedy there in the background saying, "Let us continue." He runs against a person by the name of Barry Goldwater. Goldwater was the senator from Arizona. From a political collector's perspective, he has great campaign pieces because his name was so much fun to produce pieces for. Of course, the chemical symbol for gold is AU and water is H2O. So you've got a variety of pieces that kind of play off that AU H2O symbol. He was also known for his horned-rimmed glasses. And you could have a pair of cufflinks again, little apple offense with horn-rimmed glasses. You could have a giant button with flakes of gold in water. You could be part of the Goldwater fan club. You could have Goldwater Bank, a bolo tie. Goldwater, the right drink for the conservative taste. And by the way, this is the first campaign that uses the phrases right and left, conservative and liberal. Something that is actually very common in all campaigns going forward. By the way, the water in those cans was gold. Flavored gold, flavored color, but gold. You could have a Goldwater ruler. A leader, not a ruler. Again, corporate sponsorship. Remco produced Barry Goldwater dolls. Not sure if you were a child why you'd want a Barry Goldwater doll. Goldwater came along. The war in Vietnam is in basically still somewhat its infancy, but it is ramping up. And he comes along and says, as elected president, I'm going to go over there, I'm going to bomb the heck out of the Viet Cong, we're going to win this war, and then we're going to pull out. Okay? So you see the phrase victory over communism, and also after he makes that speech, the phraseology, in your heart, you know he's right. The Democrats counter and say, in your heart, you know he's nuts. And they run what became famously known as the daisy chain commercial. It ran only one time. It was a nuclear bomb that went off, and in the middle, a la, again, Alfred E. Newman, you see Goldwater's face with the slogan, "What we were." The country, similar to the Cuban Missile Crisis, is kind of freaked out. And, you know, that you could elect this nutcase and he would escalate the war in Vietnam. What is Johnson gets elected? What happens? The war in Vietnam gets escalated. Very similar to Wilson, and this is what I was referring to 50 years earlier. Okay? I suspect many of you remember this time frame, and you're going to remember all of the paraphernalia and slogans coming up. You know, so the Great Society, bombs, bullets, bull, committed LBJ, not the USA, impeach Bomber Johnson. Johnson, of course, decides not to run for a second term in 1968, and the country thinks, well, maybe Nixon's the one. Nixon's been in hiding, by the way, for roughly about 6 years at this point in time. He runs against Johnson's running mate, Hubert Humphrey. Humphrey wants to appeal to younger voters, and he produces a wide range of almost psychedelic colors and items, okay? And here's a pair of earrings that I think symbolizes that in those types of colors. A game came out. Who can beat Nixon? Apparently the answer was no one. Nixon wins in '68. and of course runs for re-election in 1972. His opponent is a guy from the Dakotas, George McGovern. McGovern says, "I'll get us out of Vietnam." However, the big issue in this campaign is McGovern's running mate. Initially, he picks a guy by the name of Tom Eagleton. Eagleton is a senator from Missouri, and it's discovered that he has had some psychiatric counseling in the past. The press gets a hold of this and makes hay with it. McGovern very publicly asks about 7 or 8 other people to be his running mate, and very publicly they turn him down. And that's what that button on the bottom is all about. Notice there's various names crossed off, okay? You know, of all the people he asked to be his running mate. Finally, a person by the name of Sergeant Shriver agrees and says, "Yeah, I'll run with you." Nixon, in the meantime, markets his own pieces. This is a Zippo lighter with Nixon on it. Again, you could have a Nixon bolo tie. Again, if you were lucky enough to be on, you could have an Army I water glass with Richard Nixon's facsimile signature on it. Army I is the helicopter.
There's Marine one.
At the time, it was called Army I. Changed it later on. This is a Richard Nixon shower head. It's one of my favorite items. It is sitting over there. You attach it to your shower, and the water comes streaming out of his mouth. How frightening would that be to wake up every morning to see that? Of course, very early, Nixon wins. And of course, very early on, he gets in trouble with the Watergate scandal. So you have a variety of very negative pieces come out. The Watergate gang, remember the tapes, no amnesty for Nixon, Nixon's the one, Watergate, the enemies list, etc. This is a jukebox showing Nixon in prison guard. You wind it up and it says, he dances a jig to Happy Days Are Here. We all know what happens with Nixon and so on and so forth. The country again needs to pick a couple of new candidates. The election is 1976. The Democrats settle on Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter is known for his broad grin, his teeth, and he's a peanut farmer. He's a peanut farmer from Georgia. The grin will win. Republicans decide to run Ford. Ford is the peanut cruncher. Don't settle for peanuts, elect Ford. You have Jimmy Carter wind-up peanut dolls. You could have a Jimmy Carter peanut keychain or a penknife. But the country decides Ford isn't it. In 1980, behind the scenes, Reagan is having various coffee clutches around the country. And so this is a mug when he was running for governor of the Ronald Reagan Coffee Club. He, of course, is known for his cowboy hat, his rugged looks. But in particular, I want you to look, and I put this slide together roughly a year and a half ago. Look at the slogan on there. Seem familiar? It just shows that everything old is new again. Let's make America great again. That slogan was 1980, 36 years old. Reagan, of course, was the Star Wars president. If you were lucky enough to be on Air Force One again, he was known for liking jelly beans. And this is a jelly bean jar from Air Force One. What you're going to see, we're going to flip through these fairly quickly because the items become less interesting in terms of their creativity, and they also become more negative, you know, as the campaigns go forward. So this is the campaign of 1984. The big thing in this campaign is it's the first time that a woman is part of the major party ticket. In this case, it was Geraldine Ferraro. The Republicans, and they'll continue to do this, and you're hearing it even in the current campaign, you know, harken back to the Reagan years. Continue the Reagan Revolution. At one point in time, Dan Quayle gets into a little tiff in his vice presidential debate with Lloyd Benson. And Benson Quayle essentially invokes Jack Kennedy, and Benson quickly comes back. It was pretty much the highlight of the campaign, and says, "I knew Jack Kennedy, I worked with Jack Kennedy, you are no Jack Kennedy." In 1992, Bill Clinton gets elected, and he gets himself into trouble very early on. Matter of fact, all of these images and all of these slogans, trust me, you're going to see, reloaded in the current campaign. What promise has Slick Willie broken today? Reinventing sleaze, another dope-smoking, draft-dodging, adulterous Democrat for Clinton. The road to hell is paved with liberal Democrats. Dole tried to put character back into the office. Bush runs in 2004, once again invoking the image of Ronald Reagan, but I love the bottom button, which was his slogan, God, guns, and guts. In 2000, we have Al Gore, and Barbara Streisand was a big supporter of his. George Bush again, he pilots, no new Texans. I refuse to vote for a son of a Bush. But the country decided Gore was a snore. John Kerry and John Edwards are the next Democrats to step up. But the country decides Kerry is scary. Bush is still running. The images there are weapons of mass deception, and that, Dick Cheney is the puppet master.
That is really wonderful.
Democrats produce a neat little marketing piece. These are impeached mints. And by the way, there are actual mints in the tin. Yes. In 2008, the big thing was Sarah Palin. And somebody famously came along and said, Sarah Palin is like putting lipstick on a pit bull. And of course, in modern day campaigns, it's been pretty much dominated by the issue of medical care. So of course, on the Republican side, it's all been about repeal and replace Obamacare. And on the Democratic side, it's, I like Obamacare. And with that, we've wrapped up roughly 125 years of marketing and campaigning. I wrote this slide again about a year ago. It's hard to say where this election will go and what marketing pieces will come out of it. I'm sure it'll be interesting. But at this point in time, I thank you very much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed it. If there's any questions, I'd love to take them now. If I don't know the answer in true political form, I'll just avoid the question and answer one that I feel like answering, or I'll just make something up on the spot. Yeah.
I just wanted to tell you that my son-in-law received a Hillary doll for his birthday.
The interesting part is, I wonder what it says. Yes.
Who was the last major candidate from Ohio? Seems to me the last 60 years, at least we had.
The last major candidate from Ohio.
John Casey.
Well, John Casey, but before that it was Robert Taft Jr.,
Yeah, Robert Taft.
who was the sitting senator. He ran against Eisenhower. He was known as Mr. Republican, and he ran in 1952 for the Republican nomination.
That's a long time ago.
Yeah.
And I think the same is true for Ferrero was.
Ferrero was also from New York. Yes.
John Glenn for Senate.
Yeah, his campaign never really totally took off. But yes,
Think of Virginia. It did everything for 100 years or 50 years and then disappears from this whole list.
I guess the point I'm trying to make is, unfortunately, you hear Pennsylvania virtually not mentioned in the last 100 years. Pennsylvania only has one. Yeah, and he's not revered as much of a president either.
No, he was the worst.
James Buchanan from Lancaster. Yes.
This is, I don't know the answer to it, but I wondered if you had any information. You mentioned that during the campaign of 1952, the Republicans approached Dwight Eisenhower, who up to that time had really been non-political,
Yeah, yes,
which he basically had to do because of his career military.
correct.
Is there any possibility that he accepted the Republican nomination at that point to prevent Douglas MacArthur from getting it? Because the two men hated each other. Not too many people realize that.
MacArthur did have a short and aborted presidential campaign, but he was not much of a politician, and he was a terrible public speaker. And so MacArthur actually launched his campaign before Eisenhower did, and it fizzled out. So it's possible, but I think MacArthur sort of self-destructed even before Eisenhower got into the race. Yeah.
Do you have a theory on why Ohio has produced so many presidents? I mean, I understand New York, but Ohio.
No.
I think a lot of it had to do with the post-Civil War era and the fact that the Northern Army, the Republican Party was associated with that. There were generals from Ohio, and it was considered the West at the time. So it's kind of the Westerners and the Easterners, and I think that has a lot to do with it. Of course, you could ask, well, why not Pennsylvania, or why not Michigan or Illinois? But
Well, I'll go with that.
I think that's why.
Yes.
1944 election, there was another slogan in my 4th grade class, and that slogan was, vote for Truman, you are human. Vote for Dewey, you are screwy.
No, but it was 48.
That was 48 then.
Yes, I'm sorry.
I see we have several fact checkers.
Do you have any Spiro Agnew
You know, there's so much weird stuff produced in campaigns, and I do have some Spiro Agnew watches. They were produced by the Dirty Time Company. That's actually the name of it. And the hands run backwards.
There was a button with Agnew in gun sights, and it said, "Get Agnew first."
You didn't say anything about President Ford.
I mentioned him very briefly. There was a slide in there that the country decided Ford was an Edsel.
Anything else? Thank you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed it and hope you found it entertaining. Thank you for your time.
That was a superb talk. Thank you, Steve. Please come back for our 2 meetings in July and think about joining us for the parade. We have a tradition here. We'd like your help in moving the chairs back to the stand back there. Steve has an exhibit over here you should go and see with a lot of these nice buttons and other things. Thanks very much for coming.